A record-breaking victory on the seas turns into a storm of outrage when America's war on drugs collides with the laws of war itself. The U.S. Coast Guard made history with its largest ever cocaine bust. But what should have been a national triumph is now buried under global condemnation and accusations of unlawful killings. You know what's wild? The U.S. Coast Guard just pulled off the biggest cocaine seizure in its entire history. A mind-blowing 510,000 pounds of pure narcotics. That's not just a few busted smugglers on a small boat. That's a whole empire of drugs wiped off the map in one fiscal year. To put that into perspective, the average annual haul typically amounts to around 167,000 pounds. This year's number? Triple that. It's the kind of victory that makes headlines worldwide. Picture the scene. Towering stacks of sealed cocaine bricks unloaded at a U.S. port, officers standing proud, helicopters overhead, and cameras clicking like it's a Hollywood premiere. That mountain of seized cocaine represents roughly 193 million lethal doses, enough to destroy entire cities if it had slipped through. Acting Coast Guard Commandant Admiral Kevin Lunday summed it up perfectly, saying, "We own the sea, and this historic amount of cocaine seized shows we are defeating narco-terrorist and cartel operations to protect our communities." There's pride in his voice, that quiet confidence of a commander who knows his crew just made history. And make no mistake, this wasn't luck. It was a masterclass in coordination. U.S. ships, aircraft, and intelligence are all locked in perfect sync, tracking smuggling routes through the Caribbean and the Pacific. Every bust was a chess move in a game the Coast Guard has been perfecting for decades. It should have been a story of pure victory. But just wait, because what happened next turned that celebration into chaos. And this is where it gets more remarkable. The Coast Guard does not accomplish this alone. Behind every bust, based in Key West, Florida, is a silent army of agencies cooperating under the U.S. Southern Command's Joint Interagency Task Force. The central point where radar, satellites, and human intelligence meet, scanning the infinite blue for smugglers who believe they can slip through undetected. Once a suspicious ship is seen, that information flows right to Coast Guard planes and cutters monitoring the maritime corridors. Crew members run swiftly, intercepting before the ships may dissolve into international waters. It's accurate teamwork, the kind developed from decades of military technology and law enforcement tenacity synergy. What makes the Coast Guard unique is its dual identity. It's part military, but it has law enforcement authority, which means it can board, detain, and arrest, not just destroy. That distinction has always mattered, especially since the days of the legendary Panama Express Task Force, which specialized in building airtight criminal cases against traffickers. Back then, success meant a courtroom victory, not an explosion at sea. But as you'll see, that fine line between justice and strength is starting to fade fast. Just when it seemed the Coast Guard's strategy was the model for law and order enforcement, everything changed. Fast. Since early September, the U.S. military has carried out 15 airstrikes on what officials call drug vessels. 15. That's not policing anymore. That's warfare at sea. These weren't warning shots or arrests. They were lethal strikes authorized under presidential orders, wiping out boats and everyone aboard. Dozens of people from Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. In one moment, the age-old cat-and-mouse game between smugglers and patrols turned into something far darker. For decades, drug interdiction meant arresting suspects, collecting evidence, and building a case, not blowing them out of the water. The Coast Guard prided itself on that balance between strength and legality. But now, that balance looks shattered. The new operations mark a radical departure from maritime law enforcement norms. The Pentagon isn't tracking and boarding anymore. It's targeting and eliminating. Critics say it blurs the line between law enforcement and warfare, dragging America's war on drugs into literal battlefields. What's even more unsettling is how sudden it all feels. One minute, the Coast Guard was being praised for disciplined, lawful interdictions. Next, fighter jets and drones were turning the Caribbean into a combat zone. It's a shift so stark that even longtime allies are asking, when did the mission to stop smugglers turn into permission to kill? And this is where the storm truly hits. The international community didn't just criticize the U.S., it condemned it. Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, came out swinging, calling the airstrikes a violation of international human rights law. His words weren't soft diplomacy, they were alarm bells. These attacks, he said, and their mounting human cost are unacceptable. Turk didn't mince words about what's at stake. He reminded the world, and in Washington, that drug interdiction isn't a war, it's law enforcement. There are rules, limits, and standards that keep the use of force proportional and accountable. In short, law enforcement arrests don't annihilate. Under international law, lethal force is only justified in the narrowest situations. Imminent threats, immediate danger, genuine self-defense. But these strikes, they don't fit any of that. These weren't shootouts with armed cartels. They were bombings of vessels, often miles from any real confrontation. Human rights observers say the U.S. has crossed into dangerous territory, normalizing extrajudicial killings in the name of fighting crime. And for nations already wary of America's reach, this felt like history repeating itself. Another powerful country rewriting the rules to fit its own agenda. As outrage grew, global headlines shifted from praising the record cocaine seizure to questioning whether the United States, once the loudest voice for law and order, was now breaking the very laws it claimed to defend. Back home, the backlash exploded on Capitol Hill. Senate Judiciary Committee Democrats, led by Senator Peter Welch of Vermont and Senator Dick Durbin, demanded the Department of Justice release every shred of legal justification for the airstrikes. Their tone wasn't polite inquiry, it was pure outrage. In a fiery letter signed by all Democratic committee members, they declared, "Summarily killing criminal suspects is prohibited under domestic and international law. In both peacetime and wartime, no gray area, no excuses." Welch took the fight to the Senate floor, warning that if the president wants to start a war, if he intends to put American troops in harm's way, then he has to seek authorization from Congress. It was a direct challenge to the administration's power and a clear shot across the bow of executive overreach. This moment reignited one of Washington's oldest constitutional battles, the war powers debate. Can a president unilaterally order lethal military actions without congressional consent, even under the banner of counter-narcotics operations? Or does that cross into undeclared warfare? For many lawmakers, this wasn't just about policy, it was about principle. If presidents can kill suspected criminals abroad without trial, what happens to due process? To accountability? In just a few weeks, a story that started as a national triumph had turned into a legal and political inferno, one that questioned not just the tactics of the war on drugs, but the very limits of presidential power itself. And then came the moment every administration dreads, when human rights groups start weighing in. Amnesty International didn't hold back. In a statement that ricocheted across the world, the organization flat out called the bombings illegal. Their director for human rights and security, Daphne Eviatar, went even further, accusing the U.S. military of carrying out a spree of unlawful violence. The U.S. military's Southern Command has gone on a murder spree following illegal orders. It was a gut punch, and it hit hard. Amnesty's framing wasn't about politics, it was about morality. They argued that by killing suspected traffickers without arrest, trial, or any form of due process, America had abandoned the very principles it preached. These weren't court-sanctioned actions, they were executions at sea. The moral fury got more intense day by day. Activists charged Washington with using national security as cover to excuse illegal killings. Echoing the worry, international monitors said the U.S. was once again on the hazardous path of acting first, then later explaining. The story was changing quickly from heroic anti-drug activities to unlimited military attack. Headlines started to paint a disturbing picture all around. The worldwide superpower that once demanded accountability from others now seemed to be dodging it itself. However, while fury burned outside, the Pentagon appeared to be doubling down within. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth made an amazing move when he instructed the Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group to move into the U.S. Southern Command area, right into the heart of the Caribbean. The message was crystal clear. The United States was preparing instead of retreating. The Carrier Group is no tiny gesture. America's most sophisticated aircraft carrier, the Gerald R. Ford, does not travel lightly. It brings a nuclear-powered submarine, a fleet of destroyers, and fighter planes able to attack targets hundreds of kilometers distant. Officially, the deployment was to strengthen operations against transnational criminal groups. Unofficially, it appeared as though the fight against drugs was developing into what seemed like a major military operation. From a strategic perspective, the display of force was meant to convey power, to warn cartels that nowhere on the sea was secure. Geopolitically, though, it shook the area. Nations like Colombia, Venezuela, and Ecuador viewed it differently, as militarization of anti-narcotics policy rather than as protection. Critics warned that such power displays risked escalating regional tensions and pushing neighboring countries to view U.S. presence as occupation rather than cooperation. Even within the Pentagon, whispers began about whether this was deterrence or overreach. Whatever the intent, one thing was clear. The U.S. was turning the Caribbean into a stage for power projection, and the Coast Guard's proud success story was now being overshadowed by the thunder of war machines moving in. Just when it seemed things couldn't get more controversial, the Justice Department quietly pulled the plug on one of the most storied anti-drug operations in U.S. history, the Panama Express Task Force. Born during the Reagan era, this program had been the backbone of America's maritime drug prosecutions for nearly 4 decades. It was a blend of intelligence, investigation, and law, a partnership between the Coast Guard, the DEA, and federal prosecutors that made sure every suspect captured at sea faced justice in a courtroom, not the ocean floor. But that era just ended. The Panama Express has been closed, replaced by a new entity called the Homeland Security Task Force, a creation with a much broader and more aggressive mandate. No longer limited to arrests and indictments, this new task force gives far greater operational control to the military. What that signals is profound: a shift from criminal prosecution to direct military engagement. The war on drugs, once fought with handcuffs and evidence, is now being waged with missiles and machine guns. For some, it's efficiency. For others, it's a quiet admission that America's war on drugs is turning into a literal war. Across the country, people can't seem to agree on what just happened. On one side, you've got Americans who see the Coast Guard's record-breaking cocaine haul as proof that the nation still knows how to win. They call it patriotism, a victory for safety, order, and strength. News clips showing thousands of pounds of seized cocaine stacked high on the docks have become rallying symbols for those who say, this is how you protect the homeland. But the other side, they're not celebrating, they're horrified. For them, those airstrikes and the civilians who died aboard those boats are a stain on America's conscience, a step backwards into the dark days of unchecked military action. They ask the question no one wants to answer. Since when does fighting crime mean bombing suspects? The divide runs deep between those who believe power keeps peace and those who believe unchecked power destroys it. It's a moral paradox, really. How do you defend freedom by breaking the laws defining it? And that's where America finds itself now, standing between triumph and tragedy, between pride and guilt, wondering whether this was a moment of national strength or a warning sign of something far more dangerous. Looking at the whole picture, this whole chapter feels less like a law enforcement success and more like a pivotal point in America's battle against narcotics. What started decades ago as a campaign of arrests, investigations, and court sessions has slowly transformed into a militarized conflict wherein airstrikes and drone monitoring substitute handcuffs and courtroom summonses. It's about domination, deterrence, and annihilation rather than about due process any longer. Though it has serious consequences, this change may seem good on paper. Once a nation begins to normalize extrajudicial behavior, the boundary between vengeance and justice starts to dissolve. Every drone attack or targeted hit eats at the basis of responsibility, the very ideal the U.S. has long advocated to the world. If the war on drugs becomes a literal war, who ensures that civilians don't become collateral damage? Who decides what counts as justice? These aren't just operational questions. They're moral ones that shape foreign policy, human rights, and America's global image. Today, it's the Caribbean. Tomorrow, it could be anywhere a drug route exists. So the question remains, is this a victory against crime or a step into something far darker? A future where America wins battles, but loses the values that once defined its cause. The Coast Guard may have captured more cocaine than ever before, but America's moral compass seems to be drifting off course. The question now isn't how much was seized, it's how many lives were lost along the way. Like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories behind the headlines.